The air inside the barrack was thick with coal dust and despair. It was February 1945, somewhere east of the Oder River. Outside, the wind screamed across the snowfields. Inside, 60 German women POWs stood in silent rows, their ribs visible through tattered uniforms. A rusted pot hissed on a metal drum stove. The only sound in the room. They waited for the signal to eat. Instead, the Soviet guard kicked the pot over. Steaming cabbage soup splattered across the wooden floor. Nobody moved. The smell of sour cabbage and iron filled the room. The guard barked something in Russian, too fast to understand, then pointed to the puddle of soup on the ground. A translator's voice cut through the silence. "You will eat it from the floor." Shock froze the line. For a heartbeat, no one dared breathe. Then one woman, pale, maybe 20, slowly knelt down. Her hands trembled as she scooped a handful of soup mixed with mud and ash. A single drop fell back, hitting the wood like a gunshot. One by one, others followed, some weeping quietly, others blank, faced, too numb for shame. The guard watched without blinking. Reports later called it a disciplinary humiliation. The Soviets had taken nearly 900 German women prisoner from the ruins of the Eastern Front. According to camp logs, less than half survived that first post, or winter. For many, this was their introduction to captivity, not beatings, not interrogation, but a command designed to erase self-respect. One prisoner wrote later, "They wanted us to crawl like dogs, but hunger talks louder than pride." And hunger did speak. When your stomach has been empty for 3 days, you don't think about dignity. You think about calories. The floor became a battlefield between shame and survival, but humiliation has a long memory. In that barrack, as boots crunched on frozen mud and steam curled up from spilled soup, something changed not just in their stomachs, but in their eyes. Each woman realized this was not just punishment. It was a message: you are defeated. And yet, as her hand touched the dirt and her breath fogged against the cold plank floor, a question burned beneath the silence. How did they end up here, crawling for soup in the ruins of an empire? That question takes us back to the final days of Königsberg. Smoke rolled over the city like a living thing. February 1945, Königsberg, East Prussia. The air stank of burning stone and diesel. Somewhere in the chaos, church bells rang once, then shattered under artillery thunder. For months the people had believed the city would hold. Now 80% of it was rubble. Windows glowed orange from fires licking through old brick. Inside the hospitals, nurses tied bandages with shaking hands while roofs collapsed overhead. Among them was Anna Keller, a 24-year-old field nurse. She had never fired a weapon, but the order had come down: every able woman would join the defense line. They handed her a rifle with no bullets and told her to stand firm for the fatherland. Outside, Soviet shells pounded the medieval walls every 6 seconds. Men screamed. Horses ran ablaze through the streets. When the first T-34 broke through the gate, panic became sound, raw, endless. Eyewitness reports say 100 civilians were trapped in that inferno. 42,000 died in just 2 weeks. Königsberg's proud spires cracked and fell, burying hospitals, schools, and whole families beneath centuries of history. Anna remembered trying to drag a patient out from a collapsing corridor when Soviet troops stormed the ward. No one resisted. There was nothing left to defend. They said we'd be safe behind the castle walls. She whispered later in a prisoner's journal. But safety had turned to smoke. The Red Army was tired, brutalized by 4 years of vengeance. Some soldiers offered water, others took revenge in silence. For the women who survived those first chaotic days, capture felt almost merciful until the march began. By April, the fortress had fallen. Corpses lay frozen in doorways. The last radio broadcast ended mid-sentence. Anna and hundreds like her were herded into columns, stripped of possessions, and marched east under a grey, endless sky. The winter wind cut through their thin wool coats. The road ahead stretched beyond imagination, Behind them, Königsberg smoldered, a city erased. Ahead, unknown miles, unknown hands, unknown rules. As they stepped into the snow, one officer muttered to another, "This is only the beginning," and for the prisoners it truly was. Boots crunching, breath shallow, they began their long walk into captivity. The nightmare wasn't the destination yet. It was the road itself. Snow fell in slow, heavy sheets, swallowing the sound of everything except boots and wind. The column stretched for miles, women, old men, teenage boys shuffling east under Soviet rifles. Every few yards, someone collapsed. No one was allowed to stop. Guards barked in Russian, sometimes striking with rifle butts, sometimes just staring through frost, bitten eyes. The horizon never changed, only grey sky and endless white ground. For the women of Königsberg, this was not transport, it was purgatory on foot. They were given a crust of black bread every second day, and water scooped from ditches that froze by evening. When one woman stumbled, the guard behind her tossed a frozen potato at her head, laughing. She picked it up anyway and bit through the ice. Hunger had no pride left to lose. Military records later showed some columns stretched up to 20 miles long, thousands of prisoners moving like a single shivering organism. Temperatures fell below 25 degrees C, turning breath into glass and fingers into stone. Those who couldn't keep up were left behind, their shapes disappearing into the snowdrifts. Survivors recalled counting the bodies they passed, one every 10 steps. Anna walked near the middle, her legs trembling from frostbite. She remembered the faces of nurses she'd trained with gone now, lost somewhere behind the line. Every night, when the guards halted, they were herded into barns or open fields, sleeping on straw stiff with ice. The moans of the sick and the quiet sobbing of the young filled the dark. The road itself wanted us dead. One survivor later wrote, "It didn't need bullets. The Soviets didn't have to shoot. Exhaustion and cold did the killing for them." A few guards handed out snow to melt for water, more from pity than orders. Others shouted, faster German women, Moscow waits. By the 10th day, they crossed a frozen river under a blood-orange dawn. Someone whispered that the camps were near. But no one knew what camp meant. Prison, labor, death. They didn't ask, they just walked. When the column finally stopped before a fenced compound and a red star painted on the gate, the silence broke into murmurs. Relief, fear, confusion, the guards gestured forward. They had arrived. What waited inside would make the march feel almost merciful. The gates loomed out of the mist like the ribs of a dead beast. A red star, crudely painted, flaked in the cold wind. Barbed wire curled along the fence like black vines. This was Camp 517, somewhere deep in Soviet-occupied territory, though no map showed it. When the women finally staggered inside, the first thing they saw wasn't soldiers or food. It was a pile of discarded boots and hair. A guard shouted for silence, then came the orders barked in Russian, strip, everything. The women hesitated, clutching their rags. A translator repeated, sharper, clothes off. Within minutes, the snow-filled yard turned into a scene of shivering bodies, pale under grey daylight. Disinfection came next, buckets of cold chemical solution dumped from tin pails, the stench of bleach mixed with fear. Inside the barracks, the walls dripped with condensation. Rows of triple bunks, one blanket per bed. Rats ran across the rafters. Dinner that night was a metal bowl of watery kasha. They were told to eat quickly. Someone tried to ask for bread. The guard answered with silence. Records show 1 in 5 prisoners at such transit camps died within the first 3 months. Lice, typhus, and starvation did what bullets didn't. Names disappeared from lists as easily as frost from breath. A survivor later wrote, "We stopped being women, we became numbers." The uniforms they received were men's oversized, patched, still smelling of sweat. Some had Cyrillic names stitched inside. Anna's uniform bore the name Ivanov. She wondered who he was and if he was alive. Nights were filled with coughing and whispers. A few tried to pray, but no one knew which God would listen here. Outside, Guards smoked cigarettes beside the watchtower light. Every sound, chains, dogs, metal gates, became part of the camp's rhythm. And yet, amid all the rules, one rumor moved like smoke among the prisoners. Something about discipline orders, about how the Soviets punished disrespect. A whispered phrase passed from bunk to bunk, "They make you eat from the floor." Anna didn't believe it until she saw the smirk on a guard's face during the next inspection. The kind of smirk that said the worst was still coming. The next morning, the bowls disappeared. The day began like every other. Grey sky, whistle blast, boots on mud. But this morning, something was different. The bowls were gone. Soldiers carried buckets instead, steaming with thin cabbage soup. A Soviet sergeant in a long coat stood before the line, his breath turning white in the air. He didn't shout. He just looked at the women, then pointed to the ground. A translator's voice echoed across the yard. No bowls from the floor. The prisoners froze. Someone thought it was a mistranslation. It wasn't. The guards began sloshing soup straight onto the dirt-hot liquid, hissing as it hit the frozen ground. The smell filled the camp. Sour cabbage, rot, diesel smoke. The sergeant folded his arms, waiting. At first, no one moved. Then a guard fired a warning shot into the air. The sound bounced off the wooden walls. A woman in the front row knelt slowly, her hands shaking. She hesitated, then lowered her face to the mud. The others followed, one by one, crawling through the steam, scooping what little they could. According to Soviet disciplinary logs, 27 separate infractions were punished by forced degradation, eating off the floor among them. The official phrase was lesson in humility. The unofficial one was revenge. Anna could feel every eye on her. Pride burned in her chest, but hunger was louder. The soup was mixed with gravel, boots stomping inches away. He said, one woman later recalled, "Eat from where you crawled from." That night no one spoke. They just lay on the bunks, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind scrape the walls. Some whispered prayers, others cursed under their breath. Anna couldn't forget the sergeant's face. Calm, almost bored. For him, this was routine. For them, it was the death of dignity. Yet even in that humiliation, something unexpected sparked. A dark, furious will to survive. They weren't soldiers anymore, but they could endure. They would endure, but the Soviets knew hunger was a sharper weapon than any whip. And when rations were cut even lower the next week, the real fight began. Not against the guards, but against their own bodies. The lesson in humility was only beginning. By mid-March, the hunger had teeth. It bit through willpower, through pride, through bone. The official ration dropped to 600 calories a day, half a loaf of black bread, one ladle of watery soup. Sometimes even that never came. The guards called it economy measures. The prisoners called it what it was, slow death. Frost still crusted the edges of the barracks. Women woke dizzy from malnutrition, their hair coming out in handfuls. They chewed bark, gnawed on frozen straw, sucked icicles for water. When the next bucket of soup came, the guards made a joke of it, tipping it onto the dirt again, laughing as prisoners scrambled to scrape it up with tin spoons or bare fingers. The ground itself turned slick from grease and mud. In a single week, 10 women collapsed during roll call. 2 never got up again. Camp reports from the Soviet archives later confirmed mortality doubling in facilities where food denial orders were used as punishment. It wasn't about discipline anymore, it was control. Hunger made obedience effortless. Anna stopped feeling hunger as pain. It became rhythm. Her stomach tightened, then loosened, then nothing. She watched one guard, a boy barely 20, hesitate when he poured their soup. He looked away quickly, ashamed. We weren't fighting them anymore. One survivor wrote later, "We were fighting our bodies." Some prisoners whispered of rebellion, of refusing to eat off the ground again, but they knew the cost. A rifle butt, a night in the punishment cell, or worse, disappearance. So they ate, silent and slow, their faces inches from mud. Dignity was a luxury no one could afford, and yet cracks appeared, not in the women, but in the guards. A few started turning their backs during feeding time, pretending not to see the crawling shapes. One night, Anna saw the young guard from before sitting alone outside the barracks, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. His face looked as hollow as theirs. He exhaled smoke into the frozen dark, then glanced toward the barracks hesitating, as if fighting some private war of his own. The next night he didn't bring his rifle, he brought something else. The night was brittle with cold, the kind that makes silence louder. Inside the barracks, the women huddled together for warmth. Outside, under the weak beam of a searchlight, the young Soviet guard stood alone. His name tag read M. Petrov. He couldn't have been older than 20. The war had carved the same hollows into his cheeks that starvation had carved into theirs. Anna watched him through a crack in the wooden wall. He wasn't like the others, no swagger, no cruelty in his eyes. Just exhaustion. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaled and glanced toward the barrack window. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before he looked away. Then, almost carelessly, he flicked the half-burned cigarette toward the wall. It bounced off the plank and landed near the door. No one moved at first. Then one woman crawled forward, picked it up, and broke it in half so two could share. Smoke drifted through the room, sharp and strange, a forgotten taste of the world beyond barbed wire. The next night Petrov lingered again. This time he tossed something small wrapped in cloth. A crust of bread hard as stone. He didn't wait for thanks. He just turned and walked back to the guard post, boots crunching in rhythm with his guilt. According to declassified Soviet records, 3–5% of guards were disciplined for unauthorized fraternization, a broad term that could mean anything from speaking kindly to feeding a prisoner. Punishment ranged from demotion to firing squad, but some still did it, not out of mercy perhaps, but recognition. The line between captor and captive had blurred. He looked as tired as we were. Anna would write later. And for 1 second, it felt like the war had forgotten to hate. The other guards noticed soon enough. Whispers spread, suspicion followed. Petrov's kindness could cost him everything, yet the small act sparked something invisible inside the barrack, an ember of defiance. If a guard could remember humanity, so could they. The next morning, Anna saved a crumb of her ration, not for herself, but for the sick woman on the top bunk. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival with dignity, and that single crumb would become the seed of something larger. A secret network of hope inside Camp 517. By the end of March, hunger had become routine, so constant it no longer shocked, only defined. But that small gesture from Petrov, the guard with the cigarette, had cracked open something inside the women. They began noticing opportunities, tiny, almost invisible chances, to feed each other, to keep someone alive one more day. It started with a crust hidden in a boot, then another wrapped in a sleeve cuff. Soon, they built an invisible chain of defiance that ran through the barracks like a heartbeat. Anna became part of it without words. Each night after roll call, she'd tear her ration in half, tucking a piece under the straw mat of the sickest woman in her row. Others followed. Bread travelled silently from bunk to bunk, passed beneath blankets behind backs through whispered code. 2 taps meant share, 1 tap meant safe. Soviet camp records later revealed that in barracks where prisoners shared food, survival odds rose by nearly 40%. Starvation might still take bodies, but it couldn't take unity. Guards noticed less fighting, fewer breakdowns. They didn't know why. They thought discipline was finally working. It wasn't. The women were building their own system, order without authority, mercy without permission. If one of us ate, all of us did. Anna later told an interviewer, "That's how we beat them quietly." But secrets don't last long in a place built on surveillance. One morning, a guard found crumbs near a bunk. He shouted, overturned straw, kicked the wooden boards loose. The women stood still, faces blank, no one spoke. He found nothing else, just dirt and air. Yet word reached the commandant, an infraction they called it. The next day, soldiers marched into the yard, their boots thudding like drums. The order was simple and cruel: you will eat from the floor again. This time, the buckets of soup weren't even food. They were power, boiling and bitter. But the women had changed since the first humiliation. Their eyes no longer carried fear, only something heavier: resolve. The guards didn't see it yet, but the punishment they thought would break these women was about to ignite something they couldn't control. Morning rolled in under a sky the color of steel. The women were marched into the yard again, lined up in formation. Buckets of soup steamed in the frost, the same smell of boiled cabbage and metal that had haunted them for months. The commandant stepped forward, tall, expressionless, gloved hands clasped behind his back. "Eat," he said through the translator from the floor. This time no one moved. The silence was louder than any gunshot. Steam curled from the buckets. Flies buzzed near the mud. A dog barked somewhere beyond the wire, but inside the yard only breath clouds moved. The commandant repeated the order, voice sharper now. Still nothing. The women stood like statues, faces thin but unbroken. Anna felt her knees tremble, not from fear, but from cold and disbelief. For months they'd obeyed every humiliation. But something inside them had shifted since the secret bread line. The body could starve, but dignity had learned to survive on scraps. A soldier raised his rifle, another followed. Everyone expected the crack of a shot, but the commandant hesitated. Executions required paperwork, witnesses, signatures. This was supposed to be discipline, not massacre. Reports later confirmed that across multiple Soviet camps, at least 12 prisoners were executed for defying similar orders. But here, on this freezing morning, the trigger never pulled. Instead, the commandant stared at them, these hollow, half-dead women standing in defiance, and realized something unsettling. They weren't afraid anymore. And without fear, control was an illusion. Better to die standing. One later wrote in her diary, "We had already crawled enough." Minutes passed. Then quietly the commandant nodded to his men. The guards lowered their rifles. The buckets of soup stayed untouched in the mud. No one ate. The women were marched back to their barracks in silence, victory carved into their empty stomachs. That night no one slept. They waited for retribution, beatings, starvation, anything, but nothing came. The next morning, the guards acted as if the standoff had never happened. No orders, no punishment, just a strange, heavy quiet. Something invisible had broken not them, but the system that tried to, and days later, a shift began that none of them could explain. The morning after the standoff arrived without warning shots. Just the same grey light, the same roll call whistle. But something felt off. Different, fragile. The guards avoided eye contact. Orders were shorter, muttered. When the women marched to the yard, the commandant wasn't there. Only the younger soldiers remained, staring at the ground as if ashamed of it. Then came the small miracle. A guard, Petrov, the same one who once tossed the cigarette, walked into the mess area carrying a pot. He set it down on a wooden table instead of dumping it onto the floor. For a second, no one moved. Was it a trick? A test. The steam rose in lazy spirals. Finally, one woman stepped forward, ladled soup into a tin cup, and stood waiting for the shout that never came. None did. That's how it started, quietly, without ceremony. Historians later noted a sharp drop in camp death rates by mid-1946, nearly 50% lower than the year before. Soviet authorities issued new directives urging humane discipline and better hygiene, but the real change wasn't on paper. It was in how the guards began to see the prisoners not as enemies, but as human beings in the same war-torn world. They were human again, one former guard later said, and so were we. For Anna and the others, the shift felt surreal. Food still barely enough, cold still unrelenting, but the rules softened. A guard returned a scarf. Another handed out extra bread from his own ration. The tone of orders changed from rage to routine. The humiliation rituals quietly vanished. The women didn't celebrate. They didn't trust it, but slowly they began talking again. Someone hummed a lullaby one night, and instead of shushing her, the guards let it play. Humanity had crept back into the camp like Thor through frozen soil. The punishment meant to erase dignity had instead taught both sides its value. And, as the thaw of 1946 spread across the steppe, word came down, some prisoners would soon be released. For the first time, the women dared to imagine something impossible going home, but home, as they would soon learn, was no longer what they'd left behind. Spring thawed the mud around Camp 517, but the women's bodies still carried winter inside them. By 1947, the first lists of repatriation candidates appeared, thin sheets of paper pinned to the barrack door. The names were in Cyrillic, hard to read. Those who found themselves listed cried without sound. After years of crawling through hunger, survival itself felt like disbelief. Anna's name was there. She was 26 now, older than the calendar said. When she boarded the transport truck, she didn't look back at the camp. She just touched her chest once, as if sealing the memory inside. The journey home took weeks, across frozen rivers, gutted towns, and rail depots crowded with faces that looked like ghosts. At every stop, Soviet guards handed out scraps of bread and postcards. "You may write one line," they said. And so they did. Letters began trickling into the ruins of Germany. Charred apartments, hollow train stations, refugee shelters. Their handwriting was uneven, their words restrained, but one line appeared again and again. "They made us eat from the floor, but we stood back up." Between 1945 and 1949, around 300 German women were repatriated from Soviet captivity. Many returned sterilized or ill. Most said nothing for decades. West Germany's reconstruction left no room for their stories. Silence became their uniform now. For every survivor who came home, another two were never seen again. Anna stepped off the train in Berlin and barely recognized it. Streets she'd once walked as a girl were now craters and dust. She found her old hospital in ruins, only a single wall standing, covered in ivy. She sat there for hours, clutching the postcard she'd written from captivity, the ink smudged by tears and frost. "We carried shame that wasn't ours," she later told a journalist, "not shame of guilt but of memory, the kind that no one wanted to hear." Yet, as Europe rebuilt, fragments of truth began to surface, scraps of diaries, Soviet medical reports, faded photos. Each carried a whisper of the same moment, the floor, the soup, the crawl, the refusal. And decades later, historians would start asking the question the world had avoided for too long. What really happened to the women who ate from the floor and survived? Decades later, dust-covered archives began to speak. Historians unearthed Soviet camp logs, letters smuggled home, and diaries written on scraps of linen. One, found in a Moscow storage vault, began with 6 words that burned through time. Hunger was the teacher, mercy the test. The handwriting was faint, but the story was clear. What was meant to humiliate had become proof of endurance. By the 1990s, researchers estimated that over 1 million Axis women had passed through Soviet captivity between 1945 and 1950. More than 400 never returned. Their names filled newly opened Red Army records, each one a ghost resurfacing after half a century of silence. For the first time, their pain wasn't propaganda. It was evidence. Documentaries followed. Historians pieced together testimony from both sides, German nurses, Soviet guards, and Red Cross workers who'd seen the aftermath. One former guard admitted, "We thought breaking them would make us strong, but it made us sick. The cruelty of the camps had infected everyone, captor and captive alike." Anna Keller's name reappeared in one such archive, a single line beside a faded photograph. She had lived until 1981, working as a midwife in a small town outside Hamburg. In her last interview, she said quietly, "They broke us to see if mercy could survive." It had, for decades, the phrase "you'll eat from the floor" symbolized shame, degradation, loss. But history's slow uncovering revealed something the punishment never intended: dignity's resilience. Beneath every act of cruelty lay the stubborn human instinct to stay human. Modern historians now teach Camp 517 not as a tale of vengeance, but as a study in endurance, the point where the machinery of hate collapsed under its own weight. No victory speeches, no absolution, just a haunting truth. Those who endured the lowest form of survival had somehow preserved the highest form of humanity. Today, visitors in museums pause before a black and white photograph of those women, thin, unbroken, eyes hollow yet alive. The caption reads simply, "Captured, but not conquered." The punishment that was supposed to erase their dignity became its final proof.